Good morning, and welcome to another webcast presented by Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. My name is Robin Miller, and I'm Senior Corporate and Tax Counsel for Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Today's topic is political campaign activities and electioneering, and what 501c3 organizations can do in this 2020 election year. But before we get into the subject, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Our mission is to provide free legal services to small, community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. And we do that by matching those nonprofits with eligible volunteer attorneys from leading corporations and law firms here in Atlanta who can assist with their business legal needs. We are grateful to our volunteers every day to be able to provide these services. In order to become a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, you need to be an existing 501c3 organization. We do not take startups. You need to serve or be located in the greater Atlanta area, and greater Atlanta is pretty broad. And you have to serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. In addition, you have to be unable to afford to pay for legal services. We do webcasts once a month. We also have a lot of live presentations that you can attend once a month. And we have hundreds of resources on our website, so please be sure to check out our website. Where you can find not only our upcoming list of events coming up, as well as all of those articles. And we have a YouTube channel where you can find past copies of our webcasts that we have done. They're also on our website. Today's presentation is general information. It does not constitute specific legal advice, and I need to let you know that it is copyrighted. All right, now let's turn to the subject at hand. But we allow people to ask questions ahead of time as they sign up for our webcast, and it occurred to me in looking over some of those questions that there's a little bit of confusion around political activity versus lobbying versus advocacy. So I want to clear that up because today is political activity. We are not discussing lobbying or advocacy. So political activity involves anything involving an election, candidates, political parties, anything related to voting and those sorts of issues. And so we're going to cover all of that today. Lobbying involves legislation and passage or opposing legislation at every level of government. Advocacy is advocating for a certain position without talking about a specific bill or a specific law that you want removed. So that's advocacy. And we have a lot more information about lobbying on our website. If you go onto our website, pbpatl.org, and you can put in into the search box lobbying, and it will come up. And then we have a number of articles and a webcast on that subject. So if that's what you're interested in learning about, I highly suggest you go there. So now let's turn to political activity, which is our topic of the day. So there's different rules for 501c3s, 501c4s, and 527s. And that really, those three entities run the gamut of what's available in terms of political activity. So what are these different entities? So 501c3s are organizations that are organized and operated exclusively for charitable, religious, educational, scientific, literary, and a few other things I won't go into. Those kinds of activities are what falls under Section 501c3, and organizations that conduct those activities and meet the other requirements will be recognized as 501c3 organizations. 501c3 organizations are special because people that donate to them or companies that donate to them can take a tax deduction for the donation potential. 501c4 organizations are social welfare organizations, and they are focused on helping improving the community and looking out for the social welfare of the community. There's no tax deduction for giving to a 501c4. And then there's 527s, which are PACs, political action committees. And each one can do a different amount of lobbying, or political activity. 501c3s are the ones that we're focused on and all that we're talking about today, because that's who Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta represents. So this entire webcast is focused on 501c3s only. And each of those other entities serve different functions and provide different services, but that's just not our focus today. So now let's talk about political campaign activity in the context of 501c3s. So in 1954, Lyndon Johnson had an amendment passed in Congress that created an absolute prohibition for 501c3s when it comes to political activity. And what does that mean? Well, all 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for elective public office. Now, I'll start out by saying that the original Johnson Amendment did not include the or in opposition to, and that's why it's in parentheses, it was added later. But each one of these words is defined in the regulations to the Internal Revenue Code. So in the Treasury regulations, it defines directly or indirectly, participating or intervening, elective public office. And so there's a lot of detail around what each one of these things means. But basically it means don't get involved in political activity. Don't support or oppose a political candidate or a political party. And we're going to break this down a little bit and talk about some real examples because the devil is in the details, of course, and also what the implications are. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what you actually can do in this arena, because there are some things that C3s can do and can do successfully to help in the 2020 environment. So political campaign activity includes attempting to influence political campaigns through direct or indirect candidate support. What does that mean? Well, that can be actions or it can be money. It can be voice as well. So some really common activities are listed in the second bullet, and that is contributions to candidates or PACs. You cannot do that as a 501c3. That's a no-no. So you can't give money to a candidate or even on behalf of a candidate in any way. You also can't participate in their campaign activities in any way. Or make public statements for or against a candidate, or support any political party. Now, there are some organizations out there that as part of what they do, they keep current legislators or executives in check, and they follow what they're doing on a regular basis. So they may comment on something that their local mayor or their county council is doing regularly, and that may be positive and it may be negative. And if they do that regularly, they don't have to stop just because that mayor or some of those council members are running for office. They have to be very careful, and it's a very tricky area because they can't do more than they did before, and they can't do less than they did before either, because that would suggest that they're easing up on that candidate. But if it's something that they do regularly, they can do it. It's just pretty tricky, and they do need to get legal. I የሚrecommend getting legal advice before continuing those activities during an election cycle. And what is an election cycle? We're going to talk about that in a minute. First, let's talk a little bit more about these public statements and what constitutes a public statement, either in support of or in opposition to a candidate. And the IRS looks at a lot of factors as to whether something is political campaign activity or issue advocacy. They look at whether it identifies a candidate. So does that public statement actually identify a candidate? And by the way, it doesn't have to say the candidate's name. It can be references to that candidate. It could be statements that make it obvious who the person is that they're referring to. So it does not have to be by name. They look at whether the timing of that public statement coincides with an election cycle. And it used to be that was easy. There were clear election cycles. There were times when candidates declared that they were running, and then there was a period of time where they were running, and then the election, and then it all stopped. But today that really doesn't exist. For instance, in 2016, the day after he was inaugurated, President Trump announced that he was running for re-election. So he's been in an election cycle for the last 4 years. So it's really difficult now to distinguish when the election cycle begins and ends. So you just need to be cognizant of the fact that any of these political statements made at any time can be detrimental. if those statement targets voters in a particular election, that's always going to be a key element. So if the organization targets voters in a certain district where that district has candidates running, and they target them for an issue that's very clearly one candidate agrees with and one candidate opposes, then that could suggest political activity. So especially when they're identifying that candidate's position. Or if you suddenly focus only on certain issues that you really haven't focused on before, or in a way that you're focusing on it. You have to be really careful and really think through all of these different activities. Some organizations really don't do a lot of this. They're never involved in this, and so it's not really much of a worry. But if you do, are involved in advocacy or issue-oriented work, then you do need to be really cognizant about what you're doing in an election cycle, particularly in the heated part of the election cycle. One of the things the IRS always looks at is, was this statement made on behalf of the organization? And that gets into the issue of executives and leaders of 501c3 organizations, who are often the face of the organization. And so when they make a statement about a political candidate, is that on behalf of the organization, or is that as an individual? And so there's a few ground rules, and the IRS has put out a ruling on this. But clearly, executives of 501c3s and leaders still have First Amendment rights, and they can still support or oppose candidates. However, they need to make sure they're not wearing their name tag, when they go and support a candidate. They need to make sure that they're not identifying themselves on their own clearly as CEO of Charity A. Now, there are those situations where in the newspaper you might see a full page ad with a candidate and who all is supporting that candidate locally, and it'll list their name and oftentimes their position and where they work. And the IRS said that where there's a clear disclaimer that says that titles and affiliations of each individual are provided for identification purposes only, then they're not crossing the line. However, if you can avoid listing your title and your organization, that's even better. So clearly it can be done, but you want to make sure you truly have that separation for executives so that it doesn't get impugned to the charity. You also need to be careful about candidates attaching themselves to your nonprofit. Now, there's a lot of candidates in our community that maybe even sit on the boards of charities, that are big volunteers at charities, and they want to share their good works. But you have to be careful because you don't want them suggesting that your organization is thereby supporting them. So if somebody's been a volunteer of yours for 15, 20 years and now they're running to be mayor, and they're talking about how they volunteered for you for all this time, it might look like you then support them as a candidate, and you want to make sure that implication is not put out into the public. You don't want them taking a picture in front of your sign and using that on their website for their campaign. If they attend your fundraising events and they've got their button on and they're going around the room and working the room and shaking hands, you may need to pull them aside and say, we'd appreciate it if you would take off your button and just be a regular visitor or attendee at this event, and not politic while you're here. And you can have candidates who are on your board even, but you do need to be careful about how you manage that and make sure that it's clear that you as an organization are not supporting or opposing their candidacy. All right. Now let's turn to your office itself and how you operate your office in the time of an election. Impermissible campaign activity does include providing your office space, equipment like copiers, donor lists to political candidates. A candidate may come to you and say, hey, do you mind if I use your space, or can we have a meeting in your conference room at night to discuss our strategy? Well, if you don't normally offer that to lots of different people or lots of different organizations or every candidate, then that's impermissible. If you do normally, for instance, rent out your donor list to anybody that is willing to pay for it, then that's fine. You can continue to do that. But if it's not something that you would normally do, then you should definitely not do it when it comes to a candidate for office or a political party.
Robin, a question on that part. What if it's like in the situation you mentioned before, if it's someone running for office who has been a volunteer with your organization or is a board member of your organization, and then they ask if they could use space?
That doesn't change.
Okay. So
they're still a candidate for office. And just because they're your volunteer or your board member doesn't change the fact that if you don't normally allow people outside for an outside meeting, because this has nothing to do with your organization, to use your space for outside independent meetings, then you shouldn't allow it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So then you have to think about your employees and what your employees do in your space. And really, it's best to have a policy around this if you have an office environment where people are very politically engaged. Some organizations don't have that environment, but if you do, I do recommend that you have a policy. Because the fact of the matter is your workplace is not a free country. The First Amendment rights don't continue at the workplace. So you can restrict what your employees can do in your space, on your equipment, and during work time. And in fact, as a 501c3 organization, you really need to do that. Because they can't use any of your equipment, whether it be your computer, your phone, your copier, work email addresses, work phone numbers, the office address, when doing their own political activities, supporting or opposing any candidates as individuals. They certainly shouldn't be doing it on behalf of the organization, but even as individuals, they can't be doing that. Another tricky one is social media. So clearly no one should be using the organization's social media to support or oppose a candidate, and that one's easy. But there's a lot of organizations out there where you might have employees who have social media pages that everyone knows is for this employee and related to this organization. And so it kind of crosses over between personal and not personal. And if they're using that social media to promote or oppose a candidate, you've got a problem, potentially. Now, if you have your own personal social media and it has nothing to do with work and you simply list where you work, but you're not promoting all the time your organization and what you do and what your organization does on that social media, then you can use that however you want. Or employees can use that however they want. It's those ones that are in between that you really need to be careful and cognizant of, because it can easily be that social media could easily be impugned to the organization. And honestly, the risks are significant. You can lose your exemption, or you can have additional taxes applied to the organization and the managers that allowed the activity to be conducted. So that one's a little bit tricky. Another one that's tricky. Well, let's keep going with the employees. So the other thing is like what's in their office or their cube. Can I put up a sign in my office that I support a specific candidate? If it's in my office and I close the door, no, I can't. I can't wear buttons in my office to the office every day. I can't have any kind of campaign materials in my office, my cubicle, my space that I'm using in my workplace. Also, if I use my car, even if it's my personal car for business a lot, and it's expected that I'm using my car for business, no political bumper stickers either, or signs or magnets or any of that. It's really important to keep it very separate and segregated, because all you need is that employee's picture being taken with their car and on company business or C3 business, and that going to the IRS. So it's really important to make sure that you've got that very clear for your employees, and if you do have an active office, that you have a policies and procedures for that. Some employees, some organizations that do policy work will have to be also extra careful, because if you do policy work and you try to cross all lines in that policy work and not just focus on one party or one set of legislators, then if that same individual then is out there campaigning for another individual, that's going to create real conflict of interest issues. And so you really need to think about those people that are in those policy roles and what they're doing, and whether or not they need to stay more low-key when it comes to the election and their personal views, even outside the office, as it can affect your ability to do your business. One other thing, some of our clients will have links to incumbents, like the mayor, current mayor, maybe the county council, like their web pages, because of what they do, and it makes sense in the nature of their activities. But when the campaign starts, you need to be careful that those links remain the right links, and then you really need to ask, do I need that link during the election cycle, and how important is it, and is it distinguishable? So that's another thing to think through during those election cycle times. So we've talked about a lot of things that you should restrict and can't do, but now let's talk about some of the things you can do as a 501c3. And the critical element is that, and this first line, is that it's conducted in a nonpartisan manner. So the area that we're really going to focus on now is civic engagement. And 501c3s can get very involved in civic engagement, and that's really encouraging voter involvement, which is things like voter registration and get out the vote drives, and then voter education, so long as it's all in a nonpartisan manner. And voter education can include public forums, you can include voter education guides, legislative scorecards, but again, it all has to be in this nonpartisan format. So we're going to talk about that. If the IRS finds evidence of bias that would support or oppose a candidate, then we've got some issues. All right. So now let's turn to voter registration, unless we have a question.
Nothing right now.
So, voter registration. I want to begin by saying that I'm only focused on, in this webcast, the IRS requirements for voter registration. But Georgia has a whole series of requirements for voter registration. And we have an article that will be coming out in the next week or so that lays out all the state law requirements and where to find that information and the things you need to consider when you're conducting a voter registration drive. So this is really just focused on IRS and protecting your 501c3 status. So obviously it can't be partisan, and you can't screen voters. So you can't make sure that you're only, you ask people who you're going to vote for, and then you register them because you like who they're going to vote for or what party they represent. They consider themselves aligned with. Again, you can't do that. You have to register everyone. Everyone who's not registered, you have to offer to register. Anyone who walks up has to get the opportunity to register. You can't ask people how they would vote on a certain issue either, and then register them based on their answer. So it's not just a candidate, but also based on a certain issue, especially if it's like a wedge issue that that they're more likely to be supporting one party versus another party. You also can't use registration to identify unregistered voters of a certain party. So there's certain people that aren't registered, and that they're from a political party, so you go after and try and get them to register. You can't do that. It's really recommended that you select an area to canvass that is neutral, that has to do with your organization and what you do. So you can't select a canvass area because that a candidate is favored in that area. You have to select it based on neutral, independent ideas in ideology. So now you can focus on minority groups tied to discrimination, such as race, gender, language, the poor, the unemployed, those that are less likely to be registered, frankly. You can focus on those groups. You can also focus on subgroups that share common problems. For instance, you could go out and make sure that the farmers in southeastern Georgia are registered because they're unlikely or they're less likely to be registered whether they all would have a similar viewpoint on different issues. Well, they're all farmers, so they might have some commonalities, but that doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily all be of one party or focused on one candidate. So you can focus on those things. So you can go into a certain community, and it may be a community that you work in every day, and set up a voter registration drive. It's really important to document every step of the way. It's really important to document why you're doing a voter registration drive and why you picked the location you picked, and why this is good for your organization to conduct this voter registration drive. Having those contemporaneous notes will always be helpful to you if the IRS ever does question you. And like I said, this is just the IRS piece. You do have to follow state law, and we'll have an article coming out on that shortly. All right, now let's turn to the get out the vote aspect of things. A lot of similar issues here, from the voter registration, the nonpartisanship, the making sure you're not turning anyone away. When you're doing get out the vote, you should knock on every door. Don't just knock on the doors that you think are people that are going to vote with the candidate you want them to vote for, or on the issue you want them to vote for. You can't screen voters, and you need to be nonpartisan. You also can't only help people that are going to vote for a certain candidate or a certain party. You can't only help people get to the polls who are going to vote for a certain issue. You can't turn anybody down. You have to help everyone. And that's really critical. But in a get out the vote, your organization is only so big, and voter registration drives. So it's good to document, okay, we're going to focus on this area of the community, and here's why. And then for each one of these, for the voter registration drive and the get out the vote. And you can help folks with get out the vote who, can't get to the polls themselves. Maybe they're elderly. Maybe they don't have transportation. And in that case, you can clearly help to get them to the polls. You can't give them anything of value to come and vote. You can't offer them food afterward. And these are some of the state requirements, but they're also would suggest potential partisan issues. If there is a connection there, they could make that. So you have to be really careful to be very neutral and very nonpartisan when you're doing both voter registration and get out the vote drives.
Robin, a question about get out the vote. If you're working in a certain geographical area, and that geographical area clearly skews towards generally one candidate or the other, but you're trying to help the people in that area because they don't have transportation modes or something, is that okay, or do you have to try to?
If that's the area you work in, if you happen to work between A Street and G Street and First Street and 20th Street, and that's your area that you target as a nonprofit, then it would make sense for you to do a voter registration drive in that area and a get out the vote drive in that area, regardless of who they support. That's your neighborhood. That's the people you're focused on helping. And so it's a logical conclusion that you would then help them with their civic, you would engage with them civically and help them to get to the polls. And so it does get complicated because there are certain areas that are going to be more likely to vote a certain way. I mean, there's districts in Atlanta that have voted a certain way for 50 years. So those are going to be sort of known quantities, but you have to look at your mission and what your role is as an organization and what you try to accomplish as an organization. If you don't actually serve that community and you serve a community way over here, then you probably have no business being over here with a get out the vote drive. So it needs to be focused on your community that you serve. That's a really good question. Candidate forums and debates. So and we rarely cite to the revenue rulings or decisions by the Internal Revenue Service, but there is a ruling that came out in 2007 that really identifies how to conduct a candidate forum in a way that is considered nonpartisan and civic engagement and not political activity. And here are the rules. You have to invite all legally qualified candidates. And it's really important to track this. You should make sure that if you're sending emails to them all, that you track that they all got them, that you sent them, that you followed up on them, and that you track their responses back. And you want to make sure you get a response back from each one of them. And then you keep that and you document it, because they don't all have to be there, but you have to invite them all and make sure. You also can't like do it on a day when you know that one of the major candidates already has a very publicly well-known event taking place. You've got to really make sure that they have an opportunity to attend that day and to participate. And frankly, if your goal is civic engagement and really a true candidate forum, then you want to have them all there. And that's the attitude you should be projecting and taking on. The questions have to cover a broad range of issues. It can't just be the issues that matter to your organization. It has to be a broad range of issues, and particularly all the broad range of issues of the day, essentially. The questions must be presented by nonpartisan, independent panel of experts. So it can't just be random people. You have to go out and find the right people, and they have to come up with independent, nonpartisan questions to ask of the candidates. You also have to have a moderator, and that moderator kind of sets out the rules, tells everyone what those rules are, how long each candidate has time to speak on a topic, if they have a rebuttal time, who gets to ask what questions and in what order. And it's up to that moderator, who also has to be nonpartisan, to enforce those rules and to help the panelists as they ask the candidates the questions. It's also really important that each candidate receive equal opportunity to present their views on each issue. So you can't ask one issue question to one candidate and a different issue question to another candidate. They both have to be asked the same questions and have the opportunity to speak on the same topics. Now, what about, and so that's for sort of your really sort of formal candidate forum or debate. But what about if you're just inviting candidates to speak at your facility? I mean, this comes up at churches all the time, right? They say, oh, well, we've got 5 candidates, or let's say 4 candidates running for mayor. We're going to have each one come in and share their views. As long as that's done, you invite them all, it's done equally, they get equal amount of time, and there aren't questions being asked that are specific and focused to direct people one way, the parishioners one way or another, then that's fine. It has to follow kind of the same rules as you would for a forum or debate, but they have to be given that equal time, equal opportunity, and be done in a way that is nonpartisan and treated basically the same. All right, now let's turn to legislative scorecards. And there's also several rulings on legislative scorecards, and they're a little more complicated. And once I tell people about legislative scorecards, a lot of them are like, oh, well, why would I do that? Because legislative scorecards can't be focused on 1 or 2 issues. It has to be broad. So if your organization is an environmental organization and you want to focus on environmental issues and how the candidates have voted, what their voting record is on environmental issues, you can't just do that. You have to cover a wide variety of issues. So here's what you can do, things that are not prohibited. You can annually distribute voting records, but it's got to include all the major legislative issues and not just the issues relative to your organization. You can't have any editorial comment. So it literally has to be the voting records of all the legislators and how they voted. And it can be by district, it can be, different things, but it just has to be really factual information that you're sharing with the public. And there can be no sort of comment or editorial opinion. It also can't in any way imply any kind of approval or disapproval of any of the candidates or their voting records. Again, it has to be unbiased and nonpartisan. Other activities that are not permitted when it comes to like a legislative scorecard or voting record is you can send a questionnaire to the candidates on a wide variety of issues. It can't just be on those environmental issues that are only important to you. It has to be on a wide variety of issues. So you can't do that. You have to put all of their responses in your voter guide, whatever those responses are. And you can't just select issues based on what's important to the electorate in that area. So it really has to be this broad brush of topics and issues and opinion and the approach of the legislators or their voting records. So obviously what is prohibited, just to be clear, is questionnaires containing questions that evidence bias. Voter guides that focus on issues only important to the organization. And a guide that emphasizes one area showing that it's really nonpartisan, where that's the purpose. There's one other thing that you need to consider, and I've had this question come up before. Candidates cannot be asked to sign pledges on any issue, where they pledge to support or oppose issue A. You cannot ask candidates to do that. That constitutes impermissible political activity. And so that really covers some of the areas that you can get involved in: civic engagement activities where you're educating the public, getting them to register, making sure they're voting, and sharing with them some of the issues and stances of the various different candidates on a wide variety of issues so that they can be active and engaged voters. With that, I don't have anything else on political activity unless there's some questions.
I do want to highlight one question. You touched on this, but are there differences in what is permitted in terms of social media activism or statements versus in-person actions?
It's the same. I mean, you really, if you're going to say something, whether you do it on social media or you do it in person, the same rule applies. If it's someone representing the organization and in their organizational capacity, whether it's in person or on social media, it could be improper political activity.
I don't see any more questions.
I think there might be one coming in.
Okay.
Give it a minute.
Oh, one other question, while we wait for this other one that might be happening. One person previously asked, when does advocacy cross the line into political activity?
So it doesn't. Those are two completely different things, right? That advocacy leads into lobbying and not into political activity. So now if you're talking about promoting an issue and saying, you know, like, and kind of beating around the fact that candidate A opposes this issue and candidate B supports this issue, and here's where you sit on this issue. Maybe you oppose this issue or you support this issue. So if you support this issue, then you're going to support candidate B. And so if you present it in that way and it's very clear that you're then supporting candidate B, that kind of issue advocacy or wedge issue can be seen as political activity. And maybe that's what they're referring to.
And no, that's all the questions that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you.